I'm going to just talk a little bit about terms and conditions and also about the format and what's going to happen today. I'm going to be introducing the speakers. I'm going to be doing a lot today. Then I'm going to be writing some stuff on the blackboard as they speak. And then I'm also going to steal 15 minutes and talk about the way and this project fits into my own practice and some questions that I'm thinking about, and there are invitation to think together. They're absolutely not resolved. So it's a kind of invitation to put some questions out. So the terms and conditions, I'll just briefly say, when Teresa asked me to respond to their program, I really felt like if we're talking about economy, that it's not seen as a neutral term, and just to look very much and very specifically at the kind of injustices that it creates. And so I felt that it was really important to open up this relationship between labour and migration specifically because it's deeply affected by the flow of capital, and it's quite often portrayed as a kind of standalone, almost like a mystical thing that occurs by itself. And so I felt like what would be really good is to actually have a series of different events that look at it in a different way, but also for it to be quite interdisciplinary, so that there is a different types of people coming from different points of view and coming from different practices can engage together. So it's a way of kind of creating also solidarities and finding common ground, but also going together into certain questions that we're all concerned about. And also in terms of the way I've structured the events, some of them there were like 2 events that are like this one, so it's got speakers and then it's followed by the discussion or a workshop which we had last time that was led by Precarious Worker Brigade. And then we had film screening, and then next Thursday we're going to have a lecture by Dr. Ash Amin, who's going to talk about the current crisis and the rise of xenophobia. And then on Saturday was the last event, actually 2 events. One of them is called Anti-Fascist Self-Learning Workshop, which we're going to bring, that's with the Aesthetics of Resistance reading group that I'm part of. And we're going to bring material mostly from the Bishopsgate Institute archive to look at the history of the fascism and anti-fascist resistance, and mostly that links to the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Cable Street in East London. That's an hour and a half session, and that's followed by an anti-fascist footprint walk by David Rosenberg, who's a local educationalist, I think he's called us, and teacher. He's going to give a 2-hour walking tour of the East End, and specifically focusing on the Battle of Cable Street, what happened. So they're all, as I said, they're all kind of quite different. We're sort of halfway through. This session is particularly centered around the book that I'm really pleased to say Imogen is here, who's doing it together with Kasia, what's her surname? Marciniak, thank you. Called Immigrant Protest, Politics, Aesthetics, and Everyday Dissent. And Imogen approached me actually like a year ago, and I'm terribly late with my contribution, to send to write something about my own artistic practice and protest. And I became really interested also in their project because it's not something I've come across very often, where the issue of protest and immigrant protest itself is brought together and discussed. So I'm really pleased to say that Imogen's here with us today. So I've got my bio notes with Teresa, but I can. Imogen is a sociologist at Lancaster. Now I'm gonna. I'm doing good. I haven't completely failed. Here I go. He's a senior lecturer in sociology at Lancaster University. And her current research is on migration, borders, and social class, race, ethnicity, disability, and poverty. Imogen will tell you a bit more about the book and all the content that's in there. So I will hand you over to Imogen. And before I do that, sorry, I should just say that the plan for today is over there. We're going to finish around 4:25, 4:30. After each speaker, there will be time for like a direct question that is specific to what they talked about. And then at the end, what I will ask everyone is if we could make a circle. And then we're going to go into a discussion, which of course you can ask direct questions to speakers, but it's more an exchange rather than like an expert kind of question-answer thing. So, but I'll do that at the end. I'll direct. So, thank you, Imogen.
I want to do a tiny little bit of theoretical work that kind of to set up the day. So I'm going to begin with a quote that I'm going to return to at the end of the talk. By the French philosopher Jacques Rancière, who I'm finding really useful to think about the relationship between aesthetics and politics. And he says, if there's someone who you do not wish to recognise as a political being, you begin by not seeing them as bearers of politicalness, by not understanding what they say, by not hearing, that is, an utterance that comes out of their mouths. And I'm going to return to Rancière in a moment, but begin as a way of thinking about how we might rethink or think through, I think, what is at the moment a critical and important relationship between aesthetics, protest, and forms of resistance. So in terms of kind of thinking about immigrant protest, we might think about things like the sort of massive immigrant marches that took place in the United States in 2006 under the banner A Day Without Immigrants, which was a real groundswell of kind of immigrant resistance movements who came together, in particular Hispanic immigrants, to sort of refuse to work for a day. So they withdrew their labour. And these protests were enormous and effectively shut down for a day at least. Some big cities, Los Angeles, Chicago notably, closing factories, emptying schools, and really kind of showing how much the kind of American economy depends on migrant labour. And these kinds of protests we can see across a range of global spaces, kind of migrant protests around things like citizenship laws. And they're interestingly shared now through global media technologies like social media. And I like to think of these protests in a way collectively as kind of counter-hegemonic acts of dissent, practices of resistance, which play, I think, a really important role in exposing local violences and exploitations that are being experienced by migrant populations. But when I say migrant populations, I actually don't just want to think about migrancy as people who are crossing national borders, but I want to think about borders and open up the concepts of migrancy to people within national borders who may have citizenship legally, but who are displaced or made foreign or alien in their own land. We can think here about, for example, the situation of Palestine as a very obvious example, and this image here is protesters in the occupied village of Berlin, I think I'm saying that right, in Palestine, who stage quite spectacular kinds of forms of protests. And here they're dressed up as characters from the film Avatar, as a means both for sort of tapping into the currency of that film. So they were doing this at the time the film was released, and appropriating its sort of popular Hollywood narrative about colonial military power pitted against kind of indigenous life forms on an alien planet. And here they're kind of trying to tap into that popular imagery to stage an event, a theatrical event, to try and communicate the situation on a kind of global stage. This group in Berlin have also done events which reference the iconography of the Holocaust and also the storming of the Free Gaza flotilla. So these kind of spectacular events are ones for which we can see the ways in which aesthetics, in obvious ways, plays a part in what I would call migrant protests. Closer to home, and I know No Borders are going to talk about this in a moment, we might think about groups such as the Dale Farm, in the travellers in Dale Farm in Essex this weekend who are waiting to be evicted from their homes. These groups are both, in the sense I want to deploy it, migrant protests, I think, where migrancy becomes understood as the positionality of individuals and communities who are being made foreign through processes of minoritisation, displacement, stigmatisation and othering. And we think about this particularly in relation to things like eviction from place, the displacement of people from their place, from their land, from their space, from their localities. People without place, and how this works in relationship to the internal and external borders of different kinds. So Immigrant Protest, this book that Margareta introduced, is a quite a big research project that involves both a book and a journal issue in terms of writing, but which I've been engaged in for a long time between myself and someone called Marciniak, who's in Ohio University in the USA. And the aim of this project is really to explore and map something of the connections between these different types of immigrant protests across the globe. The problem with a lot of scholarly writing on migration is it really focuses, or can tend to focus, on kind of forms of victimhood still and othering. And what we want to do in this project is bring together artists, activists and academics together to rethink notions of protest, resistance and aesthetics, and draw on ideas which trouble the very processes of categorisation that create the forms of violence that are being protested. And the focus on aesthetics, I think, is key. It's really thinking about how these struggles are taking place, not only how they're communicated, but how they are categorical struggles. They're struggles around representation at some fundamental level. And this is where the work of Rancière has been really useful for this project, opening up questions of what migrancy is and what protest is in terms of aesthetics. So what Rancière argues is that politics is aesthetic. I mean, that's his basic claim. And it's aesthetic because it makes visible what's been excluded from a perceptual field, in that it allows, it enables what's been made inaudible to become audible. So for him, the role and meaning of politics is in some way to transform what the prevailing regimes of representation are, of perception are, by breaching open kind of norms or forms of common sense and spaces so people can be heard as audible and as political subjects. And his thesis stands to kind of long-standing debates about visibility and audibility in post-colonial studies. So we can think about real classic projects like Edward Said's book Orientalism, where he talks about kind of the crude essentialist caricatures of people in the Islamic world and how these caricatures underpin European and North American scholarship and art around the Middle East. And also people like Spivak, famous post-colonialist writer who writes about whether the subaltern can speak or not, and her work is about questions of audibility, the hearability of the voices of subjugated populations. Spivak. So the focus, thinking about what we can see and what we can hear, have been big themes, if you like, in post-colonial theory for a long time. But what Rancière brings to this that I'm finding really useful in this Immigrant Protest book is that he refuses an account that says that political truth is somehow obscured beneath surface appearance. He says it isn't hidden behind the apparent. And he says this idea that you can kind of, something's just hidden, you can reveal it, is in itself a kind of colonial way of thinking about notions of visibility. So he's got a much more lateral or network notion of why people who can be seen and heard, and that the struggle's taking place on a much more kind of lateral, networked level, rather than it being a case of people being hidden who somehow, you know, Western gaze can help make visible. And for him, what's really important is that it's not about making people visible or hearable, but it's about disrupting those regimes of visibility themselves. So for him, what matters, we can disrupt something and be co-opted again. We all know that's how capital works, for example. But what's really important for him is the moment of disruption itself. How can you create disruptions into these kind of prevailing regimes of perception and visibility? So this is where, notions of art and activism and aesthetics come into play. If we start thinking about these struggles around migrancy and borders in terms of struggles around perception and who gets to be heard and to be seen in the terms that he suggests. And actually our job in a way as kind of activists, as a job which is about rupturing that perceptual field in some way. So the kind of work of art, activists, migrant activists, scholars, is this work of generating forms of perceptual shock, events and communicatory forms which kind of enable migrants to be audible, for example, not just migrants, but all those populations who are minoritized within the kind of prevailing regimes of representation. To become audible for a moment, perhaps, and then it's closed down again, but it's the moment of the breaching and disruption, the opening up of what he calls dissensus within a kind of consensual field that is important. So I've kind of shown some examples of quite, spectacular sort of forms of resistance and protest. But I think it's really important to note that small-scale forms of resistance are often have as much, if not more, effect. So notions of resistance and protest tend to focus on things like, the strike, the demonstration on the street, etc. However, quite often it's important in people's everyday lives. There are very small forms of resistance which can, over time, generate and open up or breach open perceptual space in this way. Okay. I don't think I've got time to talk. I was going to talk about the work of an artist who's in the book called Lena Simic, and her work with another artist called Jennifer Verson, who was a Clown Army activist as well, about a project they're doing around citizenship in a local community. So it's a very small-scale performance art project around the citizenship test, which involved working with working class, mostly white people in Everton and Liverpool, which is a very deprived area of Liverpool, and bringing that community into dialogue with newly arrived migrants who without citizenship status, and doing performance art where they work together to take the citizenship test as part of the art project. But you can look up that project. It was originally called Becoming British, but they sort of changed the name of it. But it was a great sort of example, I think, of small-scale forms of art practice and activist practice, which kind of precisely can have quite profound local effects, but aren't spectacular. But I want to end by just saying what I think, for me, the key points are I want to make at this event, which is our activism, collective activism, I think. I want to think about us as coming together in our different places, whether as artists, scholars, or whatever we are in our different lives, is always already aesthetic. And we can see this in the aesthetics of street protest, but actually it's also aesthetic in those small and kind of everyday ways, because all protest and resistance are struggles around representation, around the histories, policies, that should read, and practices and violence of categorisation itself. So the real violence is the violence of categorisation of people. And for that reason, we have to start thinking about that as a kind of representational struggle and as an aesthetic struggle. Immigrant protest is not about a them and an us. So we have to open up the concept of migrancy beyond state notions of borders and actually think about the internal forms of bordering that are taking place. And we have to think about protesters and our work, you know, not worry too much about this, the fact it's going to be co-opted and capitalised upon, but actually think about it as making interruptions, as opening up forms of what Rancière calls dissensus within these prevailing regimes of representation. Breaching open or disrupting kind of common sense perceptions, I think, is the work we need to do. I've got 2 twos. Protest and resistance always begins from the local, I think, from below. Anything else is probably not what it seems. So we have to think about how protest and resistance is always about, in some way, struggles over place and belonging. And it takes place in everyday interactions, in the home, the school, playground, the art gallery, the classroom, the pub, the factory, the office, as well as on the streets. So I think that's where the everyday comes in. You know, these spectacular protests are important too, but actually they have to link those to these very local forms of resistance and collectivity. Okay, I'll stop there.
All your charities and campaigning organizations that are not exactly necessarily local or from within or below, and while I share some of the suspicions and some of the critiques of those, I'm just wondering what you have to say about those movements, and also the notion. I mean, Rancière moves away from the visible and visible, or the a kind of architectural model of the subterranean, but here we're reinvigorating that subterranean, the below.
Yeah, that's true.
So I'm just
in that way, below is not a useful term, but in another way, yeah.
So those were just the 2 things that came to mind with that.
Yeah. I mean, I think we could talk about that when No Borders talk at the end today, because I think, in a way, what I particularly want to say is that we get caught up in kind of state-bound notions of, particularly around migrancy, around protest for obvious reasons, and I kind of want to open that up a bit, and I want to think about the local and the kind of transnational. I mean, I don't want to do localism or anything, but I kind of want to think about the ways in which collectivities on the ground between different forms of local are important. And I think, this links to another project that I've been doing around asylum advocacy groups, where the big organisations advocate on behalf of migrants or asylum seekers or refugees can find themselves in a process of thirdification, where they become so aligned with forms of state power or other forms indeed of corporate power that they, in getting in bed with power in order to do good and help humanitarianly others, they end up actually being co-opted very quickly by those forms of power. So I suppose what I'm saying is that there's something about the local, that I'm thinking about things in terms of place and their struggles taking place, which are more autonomous or can remain somehow irritatingly autonomous in relationship to state power, that's very important in this moment. So because I think in a way there's a lot of castration of the big organisations in terms of their actual impact. So, massive state-funded humanitarian or charity organisations, not all of them, but a lot of them end up actually being able to be very limited in their actual political effects. Well, actually, it's the autonomous groups who haven't got any funding who have more effect, even though they may be much smaller.
Are they? Oh, okay. I should probably shut up. But autonomy seems interesting here. I'm also wondering where the place of the local is in a migrant context, or in a context where displacement is continual and
that's
motion
right.
and movement.
So actually, what I'm really interested in is the notion of local being where you are now.
Okay.
So that notion of belonging is where you are now. So it's not in terms of...
Yeah, but we're going to move on really quickly. Is it quick?
Yeah.
Okay, go.
Just when you gave the example of Palestine, and I was just thinking, I mean, the talk was fantastic. I was really interested in it, but just the use of the word migrants, and you kind of used it in a sense of in relation to power in general, but especially with the example of Palestine, it's kind of the opposite, because these are the indigenous population.
Exactly, yeah.
So I was just wondering about what you said about victimhood and about sort of othering and language, and what language can we use that doesn't position, yet again, repositioning people as migrants when they're not.
Yeah, and that, maybe that is provocative, but I suppose I want to open up the term migrant to a whole series of what happens is different types of minoritized groups become, through the categorization, become separated from each other.
So
through being categorized as
people from the same group?
No, people from different groups. So like we don't normally think of travellers who are citizens and indigenous, for example, to Britain as being migrants. I mean, that is, this is partly what I want to do today, is think about actually is the way in which we can use the category of migrancy to connect groups who aren't, instead of thinking people in terms of citizenship, in terms of states, how can we use a term like that? So I'm not trying to use it as a negative or victimhood term, quite the opposite. I'm trying to kind of actually say what the problems are a lot of the time, these struggles that are against the processes of categorization itself, and actually that what we need to do is refuse that process of categorization by actually saying these indigenous people, quite often are being displaced or evicted from their own land. Made. Yeah. So I'm trying to think about the category of migrant as a political category that can connect quite different types of groups in different places, rather than assume a migrant is someone who's crossed the border, a state border. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to extrapolate that here, but that's what I was trying to do in making a claim for those groups, and I can see that it's problematic as well, but I suppose that's what I'm trying to do, is just so actually let's open up categories of migrancy, to anyone who's displaced from their place. You don't look very convinced.